cold. Powerful billionaire thought he had everything until a street violinist's music unlocked the silent voice of his son and changed their lives forever. The city was alive with its usual rush. Cars honked, people hurried across the streets, and the sounds of chatter, engines, and footsteps blended into one constant noise. Among the crowd walked a man who stood out without even trying. His suit was tailored perfectly, his shoes shone as if they had just left the store, and his expression carried the weight of someone used to making decisions that changed lives. He was one of the richest men in the country, but if anyone looked closely at him in that moment, they would see a tiredness in his eyes that no amount of money could hide. Beside him walked his young son, a boy of about 8. The boy was small, thin for his age, and he held his father's hand without saying a word. In fact, he had not spoken a single word in years. He had been born healthy, but as he grew, something changed. Stopped talking, stopped laughing, stopped showing emotions. Doctors called it a condition. Therapists gave it names and specialists offered programs, but nothing seemed to make a difference. The boy lived in his own quiet world. His father, despite all his wealth and power, couldn't enter it. The man had tried everything. He had flown his son to famous clinics in Europe, brought in top specialists from America, and he even spent nights reading medical journals himself, desperate to find a way to reach him. Every time, he was told the same thing. Progress would be slow, maybe impossible. He had built skyscrapers, bought companies, and turned small ideas into empires, yet he couldn't unlock his own son's voice. That was the one failure that haunted him. They walked down the busy street that day because the father believed in small routines. He thought perhaps the noise of life, the sight of people, the feeling of being outside might somehow stir something. Inside his boy, usually the walks were quiet, as the boy would look down, avoiding faces, and the father would guide him gently along the path. That day seemed no different at first, but then, just as they turned a corner into a square, a sound floated above the noise of the city. It was not the sound of engines or voices, but something softer, warmer, almost like a voice from another world. The violin was singing. The notes rose and fell with emotion, weaving through the air and cutting across the rush of footsteps. It was not perfect, not polished like the music one would hear in concert halls, but it carried a raw honesty that made people slow down for a moment before moving on again. The boy stopped walking. His small shoes froze on the pavement, and his hand tightened suddenly around his father's fingers. The billionaire looked down, surprised. His son rarely reacted to anything in the world outside. The boy's eyes, which usually looked blank or distant, were now lifted, staring across the square toward the source of the music. The father followed his gaze. There, on the edge of the square, stood a man who looked as if life had not been kind to him. His coat was worn, his shoes scuffed, and his violin case lay open on the ground with just a few coins scattered inside. He played with closed eyes, as though he were somewhere else entirely, lost in the story his instrument was telling. People passed him by, some sparing a glance, others ignoring him completely. A few tossed coins into the case without even slowing their steps. To most, he was just another street performer in a city full of them, but to the boy, he was something. Mora's eyes locked onto the violinist, and he didn't look away. His breathing changed, faster, deeper, as if the music was waking something inside him. His father felt the small fingers squeezing tighter around his hand. And for the first time in years, he saw a spark in his son's expression. The billionaire froze. He didn't want to break the moment, didn't want to move in case his son's rare reaction vanished. He crouched slightly to watch his face more closely. The boy's lips parted just a little, and his eyes glistened with a light that had been absent for so long. It was as though the music had reached into the silence around him and cracked it open. The father's mind raced. He remembered the countless therapies where his son sat still, staring at walls. He remembered the frustration of doctors shrugging helplessly. He remembered nights when he sat alone in his office, staring at his wealth and feeling powerless because none of it could help his child. And now, here on a noisy street, with a man playing a battered violin, his son was showing life in his eyes. He almost couldn't believe it. Could it really be that something so simple, so ordinary, could touch his boy in a way that millions of dollars and endless effort could not? For years, he had been told that only specialized programs could help. He had followed every professional's advice. Yet this unplanned moment, this stranger's music was pulling at his son's silence like nothing else ever had. The father glanced around. Most people walked past without noticing the boy's reaction. To them, the scene was ordinary. A rich man with a silent child and a shabby violinist playing in the cold. No one could see the miracle that was unfolding. The billionaire swallowed hard, trying to steady his own emotions. He was not a man who cried easily, not a man who showed weakness in public. But at that moment, something inside him trembled. The boy tugged slightly at his father's hand, not to move away but to stay, to root himself there in front of the music. His small eyes were fixed on the violinist with an intensity that stunned the man who had raised him. The father realized he had a choice. He could rush on, as he usually did, always busy, always moving. Or he could stop right there in the middle of the crowded square and give his son the chance to listen, and for the first time in years, he chose to stop. He stood still with his son, letting the world rush around them. Cars honked, people pushed past, the wind tugged at his expensive suit, but none of it mattered. What mattered was the small boy who had not spoken in years, standing silently but alive in front of music that seemed to understand him when no one else could. The father tightened his hold on the boy's hand, not in control this time, but in connection. For years he had felt like a man trapped outside a locked door, knocking and waiting for his son to let him in. Now, perhaps for the first time, he felt that door crack open just a little because of the voice of a violin on a busy street. He didn't know what it meant yet, or where it would lead. All he knew was that something extraordinary was happening, and he wasn't going to let it pass by. The father stood in the busy square with his son, unable to pull his eyes away from the boy's face. For years, he had been used to silence. His son rarely reacted to anything, and when he did, it was so small that most people wouldn't even notice. But here right now, the boy's stillness was different. It wasn't the blank kind of stillness that always hurt the father to see. It was the kind that came from focus, from attention, from being drawn toward something. The boy's eyes were wide and locked on the man with the violin. His lips moved slightly as if trying to shape a sound, and his breathing had quickened. Father's heart was racing. He had spent years surrounded by people who told him what could or could not be done. Doctors, therapists, specialists, they all carried charts, numbers, and long explanations that ended with the same hopeless conclusion. They said progress might never come. They said it would take endless patience. They said his boy might never speak again. I had spent millions trying to prove them wrong. He had bought hope again and again, and every time it had slipped through his hands like water. But this simple man in a worn coat, standing in the cold and playing an old violin, was doing something none of them could. The father watched the violinist carefully. The man seemed lost in his music, unaware of the impact he was having. On the small boy in the crowd, his fingers moved with ease across the strings, and his bows slid smoothly, pulling out notes that felt alive. It wasn't polished like the music played in the grand concert halls the billionaire often visited, but it was pure, and maybe that was what made it so powerful. There was no stage, no lights, no audience expecting perfection, just one man pouring his heart into every sound, and the boy felt it. The father could see it clearly the way his son leaned slightly forward, the way his head tilted as if catching each note carefully. For years, the boy had seemed unreachable, as if no voice in the world could find its way into his silence. Yet this music was reaching him. The billionaire's throat tightened. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that something was happening here, but a part of him held back. Was he imagining it? Is this just wishful thinking from a desperate father who had spent too many nights begging for a miracle? Doubt crept into his thoughts. He had learned not to hope too quickly. Every time he had allowed hope, it had ended in disappointment. Maybe his son was just distracted by the sound, just staring because it was different from the usual noise of cars and voices. Maybe it meant nothing at all. His pride whispered to him that this was foolish. What good could come from a street violinist? What could this man know that trained doctors and expensive therapists didn't? But then the boy's small hand tightened again on his father's. It wasn't just a grip for security. It was almost like a request, as if saying, "Stay. Don't move." The father froze, feeling the pressure of those tiny fingers. And for the first time in years, he realized his son was asking for something without words. The billionaire's chest felt heavy. He wanted to pull his boy close and thank the heavens for this tiny moment. But another voice inside, Himptha, cold, logical voice that had built empires, fought back. What if he let himself believe too much? What if he stood here, heart wide open, and it turned out to be nothing? It was a man who had lived by control, by certainty, by never letting emotions rule him, to stand here and admit that a poor street performer could succeed where science and money had failed was almost too much for his pride to bear. He looked at the violinist again. The man's coat was frayed, his shoes nearly falling apart, his case with only a handful of coins. People around them barely noticed him. Some even smirked as they passed, shaking their heads at the idea of someone playing music in the cold for pocket change. The billionaire had always believed in status, in power, in results that could be measured. And yet here he was, standing, frozen in the middle of a street because this nobody was holding the key to his son's attention. The father felt torn. Part of him wanted to keep walking, to shake his head and remind himself that miracles didn't happen on sidewalks. Another part of him wanted to kneel down beside his boy, to whisper that they could stay as long as he wanted, to let the music play for as long as it would. His pride wrestled with his compassion, and for once, compassion began to win. The boy's face made the choice clear. His eyes were shining in a way the father hadn't seen in years. It wasn't just staring. It wasn't blank. It was alive. The boy's lips moved again, barely, like the shadow of a hum, as though the music inside him wanted to come out but didn't yet know how. The father's heart ached at the sight. All the wealth in the world couldn't buy that moment. The deals he had ever made, all the power he held, meant nothing compared to the possibility of seeing his boy connect with life again. The father shifted slightly, standing taller, but he didn't move away. People brushed past him impatiently, annoyed that he was standing still in the middle of the busy square. Some looked at him, recognizing the powerful man they had seen in newspapers, and whispered to each other. But he didn't care. For once, he wasn't the businessman, the billionaire, the man of influence. He was just a father standing with his child, silently praying that the music wouldn't stop. The violinist changed his tune, moving from something quick and sharp to something slower, almost like a lullaby. The boy's head tilted further, and his lips curved in the faintest way, so small it could have been missed if the father hadn't been watching so closely. Was it a smile? It had been so long since he had seen one that he almost didn't trust his own eyes. The father felt heat rise in his chest, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in public for decades. It was hope, fragile, trembling hope he wanted. To reach into his wallet, to shower the violinist with money, to pay him to never stop playing. But he also knew this wasn't about money. This wasn't about buying results. This was about something pure, something human, something his son felt deep inside without needing words, so he stayed. He stayed because his son wanted him to. Stayed because, for once, he wasn't the one making the decisions. He was simply following his child's lead. And as the notes filled the air, he realized that this was the first time in years that he had seen a door open, even if only a crack, into his son's silent world. The billionaire breathed deeply, fighting back the sting in his eyes. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if this moment would last or fade away. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away now, not when his son's silence had finally been touched by music. And so, against every instinct that told him to control, to plan, to calculate, he let go. He stood quietly, allowing the violin to play, allowing his son to listen, and allowing his own heart to feel something he had nearly forgotten how to feel. The father stood very still, his son beside him, as the sound of the violin filled the square. It was strange how the busy noises of the city cars, horns, footsteps, conversations seemed to fade away, almost like the world itself had stepped back to let this moment happen. The boy's eyes had not moved once from the violinist. His entire body seemed awake in a way it had not been for years. The father could see it in every small detail, the way his son leaned forward, the way his lips parted just slightly, the way his small hand clutched his father's with surprising strength. It was like the music was speaking a language only the boy understood. The billionaire felt his chest tighten. He had grown used to seeing nothing, no reaction, no spark, no change. Therapists had tried every trick they knew. Teachers had tried games, songs, even machines with flashing lights. Nothing worked. But here was a man with a violin, and he was breaking through the silence. The father's mind spun. He almost wanted to run up to the violinist and beg him never to stop. But he stayed still, afraid to disturb whatever magic was happening. The violinist seemed to notice the boy now. His eyes, half closed as he played, opened just a little and settled on the child watching him so intently. He didn't stop or falter. Instead, he softened the music, the notes flowing gently, as if he were playing for the boy alone. It was subtle, but the father saw it the way the man angled himself. The way his bow slowed, as though he knew he had an audience that truly needed him. The boy swayed slightly. At first it was barely noticeable, a tiny movement of his shoulders. But then it grew, like he was trying to follow the rhythm of the song. His lips trembled, moving as though a hum was fighting to escape. The father's eyes burned. He hadn't seen this much life in his child since he was very small. A few passers-by slowed, sensing something unusual. They saw the rich man, perfectly dressed, standing frozen with his boy in front of a shabby street performer. They didn't understand the weight of it, but they could feel that something was happening. Some took out their phones, some whispered. Others just stood silently for a moment. The billionaire ignored them all. The world could watch if it wanted. He only cared about the boy beside him. The music shifted again, growing brighter, livelier. The violinist's hands moved faster, and the sound leapt into the cold air. Then suddenly the boy made a sound. It wasn't a word, not even a clear note, just a small, broken hum that lasted no more than a second. But it was there. It was real. It was the first sound his father had heard from him in so long that it felt almost like a miracle. The father gasped softly, his hand shaking. As he felt the boy squeeze tighter, tears pricked his eyes. He had trained himself for years not to cry, not to show weakness in front of anyone. But this moment hit him like nothing else ever had. His son was responding. His son was alive in a way he hadn't been before. And it was all because of this music. The violinist caught the sound too. His lips curved in a small smile, and he played even softer now, his notes weaving gently around the boy, as if cradling him in sound. The boy tilted his head and let out another tiny hum. This one, just a little stronger. Chest rose and fell. Quickly, and his eyes never left the man with the violin. The father felt as though the world had disappeared. He didn't notice the people gathering. He didn't hear the noise of the city. He only heard the violin, only saw the boy. His knees felt weak, and he wanted to kneel beside his child, but he was afraid to break the fragile magic. He stood frozen, letting the moment unfold on its own. The boy shifted his weight, almost like he wanted to move closer. His father gently loosened his grip, afraid to hold him back. The boy took one small step forward, then another, his eyes wide with focus. The billionaire's breath caught. His son rarely moved toward anyone. Usually he avoided people, pulled away, or hid behind his father's side. But now he was moving forward on his own. Drawn by the sound of the violin, the violinist leaned into his music, bowing with care, playing with a tenderness that seemed to match the boy's steps. When the child stopped, just a few feet away, the violinist lowered the sound until it was soft enough that the boy could almost feel it instead of hear it. The boy lifted his hands slowly, awkwardly, as if he wanted to touch the sound itself. The father finally felt tears roll down his cheeks. He didn't care who saw. He had dreamed of this for years, of seeing his son reach out to something, of watching him connect. And here it was happening in front of him, in the middle of a street, with a man no one paid attention to. He could hardly breathe from the weight of it. The boy let out another sound. It was higher this time, shaky and uncertain, but it was his voice. The father pressed a hand over his mouth to stifle a sob. He hadn't heard that voice in years. Not one word, not one sound, and now, here it was. Fragile, but alive. His son was trying. His son was reaching out. The small crowd that had gathered went quiet. Even strangers could sense that something important was happening. Some of them even looked emotional themselves, though they didn't know the story. They just saw a silent child and a violinist sharing a moment that felt larger than the noise of the world around them. The father wanted to fall to his knees, to thank the man playing, to tell him he had done more in 10 minutes than anyone had. Done in 10 years? But he held still, letting the music flow, letting his son stay wrapped in it. He knew this was delicate, that he couldn't rush it or smother it with his own emotions. This was his son's moment, not his. The violinist closed his eyes again, swaying with his instrument, pouring everything he had into the song. The boy let out another hum, a little louder, a little clearer. The father's tears streamed freely now. He didn't care if people saw him cry. He didn't care about pride or power. For the first time in his life, all that mattered was a few broken sounds from a child who had been silent far too long, and as he watched, he realized something deep and painful. All the money he had thrown at experts, all the power he had used to demand results, none of it had brought him here. It was a man in a torn coat, standing in the cold with nothing but an old violin, who had given him the gift he thought he might never receive. The father lowered his head, whispering a shaky thank you, though the violinist couldn't hear him. Over the music, he knew he would never forget this moment. It was not the polished halls of doctors that had opened the door to his son's world. It was music, raw and human, played by someone who asked for nothing in return but to share what was inside his heart. The boy stood there, swaying softly to the notes, his lips trembling with tiny hums. His father stood behind him, tears streaming down his face, knowing his life had just changed forever. The boy stood only a few feet from the violinist, his eyes shining with a focus his father had never seen before. The world around them had faded into nothing. The crowd, the horns, the chatter of strangers, it was all background noise. The only thing that existed in that moment was the music. The violinist's bow slid gently across the strings, each note soft and tender, almost like a whisper meant for the boy alone. The father could hardly breathe. He had dreamed of hearing his son's voice again, of seeing some sign that he was still in there, trapped behind his silence. Now, standing in the middle of a city square, it was happening. It wasn't a clear word, not even a full sound, but those tiny broken hums from his son felt like the most beautiful thing in the world. Every time the boy let out even the smallest noise, the father's heart leapt and ached at the same time. The boy's lips trembled again, and then a new sound came out. It was shaky, almost like a soft cry, but it carried a clear note. His father gasped. This was different. It was not just a random hum, but a sound shaped by the music around him. The violinist heard it too, and his playing grew even gentler, guiding the boy with every note as though encouraging him to try again. The father's hands began to shake. His chest felt heavy and his throat closed with emotion. For years he had carried himself like a stone, unshaken, untouchable. The kind of man who never allowed feelings to rule him. But in that moment, all the walls broke. Tears rolled down, his cheeks freely falling onto his suit. He didn't care who saw. He didn't care about the people with phones pointed at him or the whispers that floated through the crowd. For once, he was not the billionaire everyone knew. He was just a father, broken open by the fragile voice of his child. The boy let out another sound. Longer this time, his small chest rising as though the music had given him breath he hadn't known he had. His father's knees weakened. He nearly collapsed then and there, his emotion so strong that he had to clutch his hands together to stop from falling. His son's silence was cracking, and the sound that came through was more powerful than anything he had ever heard in boardrooms or palaces or stages. The violinist smiled softly, still playing, his eyes glistening as he watched the boy. He didn't need words to understand the weight of what was happening. His bow moved with care, shaping each note to wrap around the child's trembling voice like a gentle hand guiding a first step. The father could no longer contain himself. He dropped down to one knee beside his son, tears spilling without shame. He whispered in a shaky voice, "I hear you, my boy, hear you." His words were quiet, almost drowned by the music, but his son's head turned slightly, just enough to show he had noticed. That tiny reaction was enough to shatter the last piece of the father's pride. He broke into sobs, his shoulders shaking as he covered his face. For the first time in his life, he didn't want to be strong. He wanted to feel every ounce of this miracle. The boy made another sound, soft but clear, and the father reached out his trembling hand to hold his son's small shoulders. He was terrified the moment would vanish, that it was too fragile to last. But the violinist kept playing, the notes steady and comforting. The boy swayed, his hums coming in little bursts, each one breaking through years of silence. The crowd around them was silent now. Strangers who had stopped out of curiosity were wiping their own eyes. They didn't know the full story, but they knew enough to sense the power of what they were witnessing. A boy who had been silent for so long was making sounds again, and a powerful man was on his knees, crying openly in front of everyone. It was not the kind of scene anyone expected to see on an ordinary afternoon. The father lifted his tear-streaked face to look at the violinist. Their eyes met for a moment, and the father's lips trembled as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't. No words would be enough. All he could do was bow his head deeply in gratitude, his tears dripping onto the ground. The violinist gave a small nod, never stopping his music, as if to say, "This is not mine. This is his." The boy's voice cracked again, louder, this time almost like a call. The sound tore through his father's chest. He wrapped his arms around his child, holding him close but still leaving him space to keep watching the violinist. The boy didn't pull away. Instead, he stayed nestled in his father's arms, his gaze locked on the man with the violin, his mouth trembling as though words might come next. The father whispered again, "I love you, son. I love you." His tears soaked into the boy's hair, and for the first time, he didn't care about control or image. He didn't care about the weight of being seen as powerful. In that moment, his only identity was a father who loved his child more than anything. The violinist shifted into a softer tune, a melody that sounded almost like a lullaby. The boy's voice responded again, a shaky hum that carried on longer than before. The father gasped through his sobs, pressing his forehead against his son's. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, keep going." His words were full of trembling hope, his heart breaking open wider with each sound. The moment stretched on, each second heavier than gold. The father felt as though he were living in a dream, one so fragile that if he blinked too long, it would disappear. But it didn't disappear, it kept growing. His son's hums grew stronger, and his own tears flowed faster. By now, the father was openly crying, his body shaking with sobs that had been buried for years. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't try to stop it. The music had stripped away everything else's pride, his control, his image, and left only the raw truth. A father's desperate love for his son. The violinist's bow slid into the final notes of the song, letting the sound fade into the chilly air. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the boy let out one last hum, a long, trembling note that filled the space where the violin had stopped. The father broke completely then, collapsing to his knees on the pavement, clutching his son tightly as tears poured down his face. His sobs shook him, his cries raw and unrestrained. He pressed his lips against his boy's head and whispered, over and over, "You're here, you're here. I hear you." The crowd burst into quiet applause, some people clapping softly, others simply wiping their eyes. But for the father, there was no one else in the world. Only his boy, his miracle. And the stranger with the violin who had opened a door no one else could. The father lifted his tear-streaked face again, looking at the violinist as though he were seeing an angel disguised as a poor man. His voice broke as he mouthed a silent thank you, his chest heaving with sobs. He had everything money could buy, but nothing had ever touched him like this. And in that moment, he realized he would give it all away just to keep hearing the fragile sound of his son's voice The father held his son tightly, not wanting to let go. The boy's small arms rested against his chest, and though his hums had slowed, his eyes still shone with the new life the music had awakened. The violinist stepped back slightly, allowing the father and son to have their moment, a quiet understanding passing between them without a single word. The man had given them a gift, and he knew it was not something money could buy or lessons could teach. The father's chest heaved with emotion, his tears still flowing freely. He looked down at his son's face and whispered softly, almost afraid, to break the fragile connection they had just formed, "I hear you now. I hear you, my boy." The words came naturally from the depth of his heart, and he felt an overwhelming relief. For years he had carried the heavy weight of failure, believing that all the power in the world could not reach his child. And now, in a crowded square with a simple violin, everything had changed. The boy shifted slightly, tilting his head toward his father. His small lips trembled again, but this time there was no hesitation. The father could feel a sound forming, small and broken, but undeniably real. He pressed his forehead gently against the boy's, closing his eyes as tears ran freely. The moment was delicate, a fragile miracle that had taken years of silence to arrive. The violinist smiled softly, lifting his bow just enough to let the last note linger in the air. The father looked at him, his voice cracking as he said, "Thank you. You don't know what you've done." But the violinist only shook his head, a humble smile on his face. He had known all along that this was never about money or fame. It was about sharing the music that could touch hearts when nothing else could. The father knew that now. He reached into his pocket, instinctively wanting to give the man a large sum of money, but he stopped. Money could not express the gratitude. He felt the gift he had been given was far beyond anything that could be bought. It was a connection, a bond, a breakthrough that no therapy or specialist could create. All he could do was bow his head slightly, still holding his son close, and silently promise to remember this forever. The boy made another small sound, longer this time, a hum that almost became a note. His father's chest tightened with emotion. He pressed a gentle kiss to the top of the boy's head and whispered, "I love you. I've always loved you." The words seemed to reach deeper than any music or medicine ever could. His son didn't respond with words yet, but the hum, the sound, the life in his eyes was more than enough. It was proof that he was listening, understanding, and feeling. People in the square had started to notice again. Some were smiling softly, others wiping tears from their own eyes. A few whispered among themselves about the power of music, about the miracle they were witnessing. But the father barely noticed. He was entirely focused on his son. Every breath, every sound, every small movement was a revelation. He felt like he had finally found a treasure he had been seeking all his life, one that could not be replaced by wealth, power, or influence. The boy leaned slightly into his father's arms, the hums coming in little bursts. His small hands curled slightly around his father's wrists, and the father tightened his grip, afraid to let this precious moment go. He felt the weight of the years, the silence, the frustration, the helplessness begin to lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a very long time, he felt hope. Real hope. The violinist began to pack up his violin case slowly, but he didn't move away completely. He watched quietly, giving space while still being present. The father glanced at him and nodded gratefully. "I will never forget this," he said again, his voice thick with tears. The violinist nodded, as if understanding that the gift had been received and that it had changed a life. The father took a deep breath and stood fully upright, still holding his son close. He felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. Emotions that had been bottled up for years now poured out uncontrollably, leaving him raw but free. He had spent a lifetime building walls around himself, protecting his heart with money, power, and success. But in this moment, all that mattered was the love between a father and a son. He gently lifted the boy a little, brushing the hair from his forehead, and whispered, "We're going to have more moments like this, I promise. I will always listen, always be here." The boy's eyes sparkled faintly, and though he didn't respond with words yet, the father could feel the understanding in the way he leaned slightly into him. That small gesture was enough. It was more than enough. The crowd slowly dispersed, some still glancing back in awe at the scene they had just witnessed. The father and son remained for a moment longer, savoring the silence that now felt alive. The city noises returned gradually, but they no longer felt overwhelming. The music had left a mark. The father carried it in his heart, along with the hums of his son. Finally, the father turned and walked slowly with his son, keeping him close. He didn't need to speak much. The connection they now shared was stronger than words. Every step felt lighter than before, filled with a new sense of possibility. The boy's small hums continued, faint but persistent, and the father smiled through his tears. He realized that this day would stay with him forever, a turning point in both their lives. They walked together, no longer just father and son in the busy city. They were two people who had discovered something profound, something ordinary yet extraordinary at the same time. Music had opened the door, and now the father knew he had to keep it open. He silently promised himself that he would seek out more moments like this, that he would follow his son's lead, that he would listen with patience, care, and love. As they moved away from the square, the father glanced back once more. The violinist had disappeared into the crowd, leaving only the memory of his music and the miracle it had created. He whispered a silent thank you, not for the music alone, but for the way it had reminded him what truly mattered. Of wealth and power, the simplest things sound connection. Love were what could change a life. The father looked down at his son, still humming softly, and felt a warmth spread through his chest. It was the warmth of hope, of understanding, of connection. He had witnessed a miracle, not because of money or force, but because he had been willing to pause, to watch, and to truly listen. He held his son close, knowing that this moment was only the beginning. From that day on, the father's life changed. He became a different man in small ways, softer, more patient, more willing to notice the little things. He sought out music in moments that could touch the heart, not just the mind or the wallet. And with his son, he discovered that love, attention, and presence were far more powerful than anything else he had ever known. The boy continued to hum as they walked, each note a tiny victory, a proof that the world could still surprise and heal them both. And the father knew, with a certainty deeper than any business success, that no wealth could ever replace the feeling of hearing his son's voice again, no matter how small or fragile. It was priceless, and it was theirs. The story is now complete in all 5 parts, expanded into simple, interesting storytelling.